this the one I want? This is the one I want. Here we go. Someone holler at me if you can't see that bear. All good?
We got it.
Thank you. I'm just going to adjust my view here. Okay, so this is a presentation that I'm calling Managing Vermont's Forest for Wildlife. That's me, Ethan Tapper, the Chittenden County Forester. I work for the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation, state employee, and that's my email address, ethan.tapper@vermont.gov. So we're going to start with a sort of way zoomed out perspective on where we're at. So Vermont is part of the largest, most intact temperate deciduous forest in the world. We call it the Northern Appalachian Acadian ecoregion, and it stretches from, you can see the Adirondack region of New York, way over to Nova Scotia. It's globally significant. It's a huge chunk of really important habitat, home to thousands of species of wildlife and plants. We have regional connectivity. So in addition to there being connectivity like within our communities, so if some of you are reasonably aware of discussion around forest fragmentation, which we'll also talk about in a second, you know that like within our communities, within our towns, there is connectivity. We want different blocks of habitat that are connected, but then also within our state, there is connectivity. So you can see here this image on the left, which is pointing to this sort of the ridge of the Green Mountains going north to south, and then these sort of east-west areas where these different blocks of habitat depicted here are connected. And that is also significant in a broader region. So you can see here on the right how we're actually part of this, again, this bigger picture, and those connector blocks are connecting wildlife not just within our borders, but also across the region. So we're at this sort of north-south and this east-west crossroads throughout this larger region. There's a lot of species that live here and that pass through here. This is an amazing graphic from the Nature Conservancy showing the migrations. We're part of this amazing North Atlantic flyway that funnels all these cool neotropical songbirds through us, and also other species of mammals and even amphibians through this region. Now, one of the really weird things about the place where we live and the way that we've chosen to, so, you know, we have this sort of bigger picture, all of these broader resources. One of the weird things about the way that we protect those is that we have a really different ownership model than they have, like, for instance, on the West Coast in the Western United States, where most of that is industry land and public land. Here in Vermont, we're about 75% forested, and 80% of that land is privately owned, most of it by just families and individuals. So it's this really interesting thing where we have all this land, we have all this forest, and the forest is producing public goods. So public benefits, for instance, wildlife habitat, which is something that we're all sort of benefiting from in a public sense, but also air, water, carbon sequestration and storage, flood attenuation, all these like massive benefits that forests provide to all of us are being mostly provided by individuals making decisions on their own private land. And so this is one of the reasons why the county forester job is such a big deal, because here we are, 13 people, and what we're trying to do is make sure that all of these landowners in Vermont, thousands of landowners who are protecting all of these public benefits for all of us, are doing a good job, are, you know, taking care not just in their best interest, but also carrying the best interests of all of us. And it's this really interesting sort of push and pull between individual freedom and individual, responsibility. People want to do whatever they want on their land, and also this sort of more collective vision of protecting those benefits for, sort of the greater community. And within that, I think about the work that I do advising landowners. I go out to someone's land, and I think that everybody has a role to play. There's something that everybody can do, even if you don't own land, to sort of contribute to more functional landscapes, healthier wildlife, and figuring out what that is within the context of this huge, bigger picture, which is comprised of all these little puzzle pieces, all these people's individual lands. And so the first part of everything I do, if you've been to one of my presentations before, you know that I take sort of a holistic approach, meaning that we can't just protect one thing. We need to sort of think big picture about how we take care of our forest and our other ecosystems in general. And then we're going to narrow it down to like how we take care of our wildlife specifically. So let's reframe how we think about forests. How we define forests is sort of a thought exercise, really. You know, you might be like, you know, who cares? I know what a forest is. But it's important because the way that we think about forests influences how we treat them. So most people think about forests as a large area covered chiefly with trees and undergrowth, a dense growth of trees and shrubs, a large area of trees, basically a bunch of trees, right? Whereas in reality, forests are much more than trees. So I think about the trees in a forest as like the coral in a coral reef, where they are a living structure that defines this whole ecosystem. So like without the trees, the forest doesn't exist. But if you were thinking about a coral reef, you would never just like think of the coral and like forget about all that other really cool stuff that utilizes that habitat. No, you would think about the fish, and you would think about the sea cucumbers and all these other aspects of it. So forests are just like that, where they're sort of like the most obvious and a really, really important part of this ecosystem, but they're far from the complete vision. And so a definition that I like better is this one from the book Wetland, Woodland, Wildland, which is about Vermont's natural communities, essentially ecosystems, written by Liz Thompson and Eric Sorensen, who are amazing. And with the new edition with Bob Zano as an author as well. And they describe a natural community as an interacting assemblage of organisms, their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them. So if they're talking about forests, they're talking about trees, but they're also talking about plants. They're talking about what I call invertebrates, so bugs. They're talking about fungi, and they're also talking about the physical environment. They're talking about water and rocks, and they're talking about natural processes. So as you really study forests, you know, one of the things you need to get comfortable with is the idea that forests are these systems, which includes trees, wildlife, and all this stuff, and also is in motion. So it's dynamic. They're not static. Sometimes they seem like they're static, like they just stay the same all the time just because of how long the lifespan of a tree is. But actually, forests are defined by their dynamism more than by their staticness. I don't know if that's a word. And another thing that we need to think about, so when I was in forestry school, and I've studied forestry since then, we always thought about basically like the forests provide habitat for wildlife, right? So like we know that forests influence wildlife, that vegetation influences wildlife because it provides them with habitat, right? And if it's an herbivore, it provides the herbivore with something to eat. But it's also really important to acknowledge that wildlife also influences forests in profound ways. So they're not just subject to the whims of the forest. The forest isn't completely independent of them. They're all part of the same system. So examples of that are, you know, the deer in this picture who are browsing young trees and shrubs. The examples of that are if you go to the West Coast and you see the role that the extirpation of apex predators like grizzly and wolves, as compared to when you reintroduce them, had on their ecosystems. So those predators putting pressure on herbivores like elk, and then those herbivores being pressured, not browsing in the same way, in the same places, to the same extent, and that having these massive sort of cascading ecosystem-wide consequences. You know, wildlife do all kinds of different things, from dispersing seeds, you know, to having influence on other wildlife species that in turn have influence on other ecosystem processes. So thinking about wildlife as a part of forests and not just subject to them. There's another curious example that I won't get into too much. You know, some of these other species, so I mentioned deer, beaver are a classic example of what we call a keystone species. So a species that provides habitat or creates habitat for this, you know, massive other web of species by damming rivers, creating wetlands, and those wetlands then supporting aquatic organisms and amphibians and their predators and all in aquatic plants, all these other things. Woodpeckers are what some people would call an apex predator or a keystone species as well, because of their role regulating insects and pests in the forest. They also are really important for what we call nutrient cycling, so like breaking down dead wood. Another example that Kim Royer, who's an amazing wildlife habitat biologist for the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife, talks about passenger pigeons who used to exist in this region in megaflocks of like billions of birds. John James Audubon talks about them coming into these areas and just basically laying waste to huge areas of forested land. And you have to imagine that if those megaflocks of passenger pigeons were coming across our landscape, they would have a profound influence on the forest that we'd have. I mean, they talk about completely laying waste to forests and leaving like feet thick layers of guano in the understory, smothering everything out. And so, you know, that's sort of an extreme example, but there are many other smaller and more subtle examples of the way that wildlife influence our forests. So this is another question. So we asked, what is forest, right? So what is wildlife? So traditionally, when we think about wildlife species, we're talking about vertebrate organisms, so organisms with a spine, and not bugs, right? You know, we're talking about, you know, usually fuzzy stuff, but also feathered stuff, and also sometimes scaly stuff. But one thing that's really interesting is that, so, you know, this is like this bobcat, right, is like classic, you know, you're like, of course that's a wildlife. And of course, if you see a deer, you're like, oh yeah, that's a species of wildlife, a moose, a bear, yes, yes. But, you know, and here's a graph that I got from Andrew Shortsley from Vermont Fish and Wildlife about, you know, sort of the comparative different species. These are all the stuff that we might call wildlife: mammals, birds, fish, amphibians, and reptiles, and their comparative number of species without invertebrates. So invertebrates, again, being bugs. Here is that with invertebrates. So there's 58 species of mammals in Vermont, and about, that we know about, 21,000 species of invertebrates. Worldwide, we're talking about, you know, maybe 60,000 vertebrate species, but somewhere between 2 million and maybe as many as 30 million species of invertebrates. These invertebrates are what E.O. Wilson, another amazing biologist, calls the little things that make the world work. You know, they're performing all these really critical functions in our ecosystems, not the least of which is they're the base of our forest food web. So they're feeding the animals that we do call wildlife and that we do care about. And E.O. Wilson also thinks that we should start calling invertebrates wildlife as well. All right, so in the same way that we need to think about managing our forests in a more holistic way, we also need to think about managing wildlife in a more holistic way. So you can't go in there just in the same way you can't go into the forest and be like, all I care about is these sugar maple trees that are here right now, and I don't care about any other species, and I don't care about anything else. You're not going to manage a healthy forest that way. And you're going to end up shooting yourself in the foot because you're going to neglect some of those really important relationships between different species of trees, and sort of at the community level, you're not going to be managing for a healthy forest. And you're going to get frustrated because those trees are going to die eventually, and you're going to be like, oh my God, all my trees are dead. So we also need to think about managing wildlife, not with an individual species focus, but actually thinking about creating habitat for whole communities of different wildlife species. So species like invertebrates that maybe you don't care about, or they're not, you know, a species that you're really excited to see, flies and stuff when you go outside. We still need to have healthy populations of those species to have healthy populations of species that you do care about, like flycatchers. The other thing that we need to consider, and this doesn't need to be, like for some people, this is just too much of a lift and it's too woo-woo-y and weird, but I think it also adds a lot to this discussion to think about, do wildlife have a right to exist? So do wildlife have value independent of their value to us? So that value could be economic value, you know, in the case of species that we trap, or as it is in more cases, you know, species that we like, or species that we like to hunt. So thinking about sort of if there is independent of that, independent of anything that they do for us or any value that they have to us, do they have the right to exist? And when you ask most people this question in the woods, and I do, everybody goes, yeah, of course, you know, but then our actions don't necessarily bear that out. So I hear some clinks and clangs in the background. So if you guys could just check to make sure that you're muted, that would be really helpful. I think I see your face. I see your face up there, Sandy. Maybe it's coming from you. not to single you out. Sorry, Sandy. So I like to start, almost any discussion, or we just need to consider in any discussion we have about Vermont's ecosystems, the history that we're dealing with. Far from pristine. Vermont was historically in excess of 95% forested. And in a relatively short period of time, following the Napoleonic Wars in Spain, there was a massive shift in what our landscape was. So we went from 95% forested to somewhere between 20 and 40% forested in like 50 years, in a very, very short period of time. There's this whole really funny, not funny, but crazy story about that, the Napoleon invading Portugal, and then the King of Spain having these special sheep, what we now know as merino sheep, and them getting exported to the United States consul to Portugal's William Jarvis's Wethersfield farm, and then everybody just like lost it, I guess. And by 1837, there were 1 to 1.7 million of these merino sheep in Vermont. Merino sheep can graze just about anywhere, and so people just like cleared everything for pasture, and the wool was super valuable. And so what this means is that these forests that had existed prior to that, prior to European colonization, that have been developing for like thousands of years, were like pretty much uniformly cleared in a relatively short period of time. And now most of our forests are pretty young. A lot of those areas were allowed to revert back to forest land as soon as like the mid 1800s, when those wool markets crashed. But most of our forests in Vermont are less than 100 years old and have been exploited multiple times, even since being reforested naturally. And so that has a number. I'll talk about the impacts that has on our forest in a second, but sort of more pertinent to this discussion is the effects it had on wildlife. So, to go with that super extractive, intense sort of land use that was going on, all that land clearing, that caused massive habitat loss for Vermont's wildlife species. Here you can see the last catamount, eastern cougar, that was shot in Vermont. I think it was 1881 in Barnard, and you can see that landscape behind that's just completely denuded of trees. In the case of predators, there was actually a bounty that was put on them in the late 1700s. It's just one of these things where people at that time, they just had this idea of how they were going to make the land better. And one of the ways was to treat predators who they thought were a threat to their livestock and their livelihood like vermin. And so they drove our two apex predators, wolves and catamounts, out of the state. A combination of overtrapping in the case of beaver, overhunting, and habitat loss contributed to us losing, having them extirpated, driven out of the state, a bunch of different species of wildlife. So the main ungulates in our state prior to the 1800s were a species of forest-dwelling elk called the eastern elk, or maybe subspecies of the western elk, but in any case now extinct, and caribou and moose. White-tailed deer were restricted to small populations in the Champlain Valley and in the Connecticut River Valley, but were not that prominent. We lost all the white-tailed deer as well. They were actually reintroduced in the late 1800s. We lost all the beaver, the turkey, the fisher, the moose, the caribou, the elk, the catamount, the wolves, the bear, the otter, Canada geese, marten, passenger pigeons, and others. And as you can imagine, again, thinking about the way that, forests don't just have an impact on these wildlife, but wildlife also have an impact on these forests. And so it changed the way that our forests work. And so it also had some unintended consequences. So for instance, we've had overpopulations of deer, which is largely as a result of the loss of their historic predators, catamounts and wolves, and then a whole lot of different things that make their new apex predator, which is humans, less good at our job, less hunters, more posted land, stuff like that. Coyotes moved in to sort of partially fill that niche, but not until the 1940s. And some of these other species were reintroduced. So an example of that in the early 1900s was beaver. So people realized when all the beaver were trapped out, that they were performing all these really important ecosystem functions. Again, they're what we call a keystone species. And so without that, they were losing all of these other things, habitat for all these other species and other stuff like their impact on floodwaters and stuff like that, to attenuate them, not to make them worse. Turkey were reintroduced, fisher were reintroduced to combat the porcupine problem. So if you were in Vermont in the early mid-1900s, there was still a bounty on porcupines because their predator, the fisher, which is a fur bearer, had been trapped out of the state. And you could turn in a pair of porcupine ears to the town clerk and get issued the bounty. There's all these really interesting relationships that are super hard to quantify. One of the really interesting things about the beaver, if you talk about, sort of the historic prominence of this species, is that by we think about the main impact of Europeans on our landscape as being largely like in the early 1800s. That's when most of it was. But in the case of beavers, people were trapping beavers in the 1600s. So by the mid 1670s, almost 250,000, so 250,000 beaver had been shipped to London from the Connecticut River Valley alone. They'd become scarce in the area. Prior to that, we think that there were as many as 300 beaver dams per square mile in valley habitat. So a square mile, 640 acres, that's a beaver dam every 2 acres, which is pretty incredible to think about. The prominence of that species. And while beaver populations are stable and actually rising right now, of course, they're nowhere near that because we humans also like to settle in the valleys. We've also introduced, a number of species, red fox. Some red foxes are European. There are also some native genetics, but probably the foxes we have are not native. Coyotes are not native. All worms are non-native and actually cause these massive ecosystem problems. We have a few invasive birds, starlings and house sparrows. It's just a really interesting sort of, just in this relatively short period of time, the last couple hundred years, this massive shakeup of different species. So, excuse me. This obviously, as our forests recover from being cleared for pasture, again, remember, forests that have been developing a systems for hundreds and thousands of years, suddenly are all like less than 200 years old, pretty much, except for very inaccessible, very remote. We think that like less than 1% of Vermont is still what we call old growth, and a lot of that is like high elevation stuff that you wouldn't even maybe call a forest. So we now have forests that lack sort of the complexity and the diversity of old growth forests. So, old growth forests have lots of different sizes and ages of trees, big old trees and lots of dead wood on the ground. All of those are really important habitat for different species of wildlife, in addition to just being really important to ecosystem function in general. And our forests are relatively young, pretty even age. So most of the trees, date back to that whenever it was a field. If it was 40 years ago, that this was a field that people just stopped mowing or haying or whatever, that most of the trees now are 40 years old, and it's a pretty homogeneous environment, not providing a lot of habitat diversity. Our landscapes also lack diversity. So because again, there's sort of these massive influences across our whole landscape, we haven't had a chance to develop all different types and ages of forests as different pockets of forest succumb to different natural disturbance events. So prior to European settlement, probably, about 5% of our forests were in what we call young forests less than 20 years old, mixed with forests of all different sizes and ages across our landscape. And we just don't have that now. Most of our forest is pretty even aged and pretty young. In addition to that, so that all alters the habitats that are available to different wildlife and the wildlife populations and their relationships to each other. And then in addition to that, we also have, different wildlife here than were here just a couple hundred years ago. So I want to sort of go through generally, talk about a couple sort of big concepts, and then talk about individual habitat features that are important to wildlife and that you can encourage on your own land or in lands that you help take care of, to encourage wildlife broadly. So I always, almost every presentation, I share 2 slides. One is to say, to sort of go with these 2 myths or misconceptions about the way that forests work. So myth number 1 is that people have this idea in their head, and I don't know where it comes from. I heard a lot of ideas about it, that forests are supposed to adhere to some idea of neatness in our own brain. And so like I'll get taken out on a woodlot with an old timer and he'll show me with pride how, you know, all of his trees are perfectly evenly spaced and there's nothing growing in the understory and there's no dead trees on the ground and there's no dead standing trees anywhere. And maybe he's even like mowed the understory of the forest. And that appeals to everything inside of all of us that is like, wow, this is really nice. You know, like when you walk into a park, you're like, wow, this is great. Unfortunately, that has everything to do with aesthetics and wherever that comes from inside of us. And it has absolutely nothing to do with how forests work. The picture that you're seeing there on the screen is much more closely to an example of a healthy forest functioning than that sort of park-like woodlot. So again, forests are dynamic, they're diverse and complex, which just means there's all different kinds of things going on. And to the untrained eye, it can look really chaotic and messy and scary and weird. But all of those functions, different sizes and ages of trees, dead trees, you know, evidence like this of natural disturbances, all that stuff is actually linked to really important ecosystem functions and wildlife habitats within the forest environment. So we need to sort of dispel that myth right off the bat. And within that is the second myth, which is that forests never change, right? And again, as I've mentioned earlier, I think that forests are defined not by how stable they are, but by how dynamic they are. And when stuff like this happens, when someone, you know, we have these big periodic windstorms, right? Like it seems like every year we have these windstorms, all these trees blow over. People call me because they're all worried about, you know, what happened to their forest. My forest is unhealthy or whatever. And I go out and I see, you know, just this jumbled pickup stick, you know, mess of all these trees falling over. And I'm like, wow, this is really exciting, right? Because something to them that looks like an ending, to me, just looks like the process of forests just being forest. And when disturbance events like that happen, yes, it's unpleasant. Yes, it makes your forest harder to walk through. It might be harder to appreciate how that's beautiful, but the wildlife love it. And the resulting habitat is going to be richer and more complex and more interesting. And so it's really, really important that we also need to learn to sort of embrace the dynamic nature of forests and those changes rather than sort of, you know, pushing them away. So one thing, so a lot of these features, so I'm going to go through sort of these individual habitat features, a lot of which are not things we have a lot of on our landscape, but most things, most of these are things that we have some of on our landscape and that there's stuff we can do to actively encourage them. So one of these things is big old trees, right? So anybody would say, if we like, let's say that we walked into an old growth forest, they'd be like, okay, what do I expect to see? I expect to see big old trees. And you would. It's more complicated than that. You'd probably see pockets of big trees and big trees scattered around, but you'd also see them growing amongst all different sizes and ages of trees. So big trees themselves do provide some really unique habitat, and actually the wildlife that are endemic to these more complex, like old growth forests, that is different than our younger, less complex forests, are linked to, among other things, big trees. So most of them are linked to big trees, they're linked to dead wood, and they're linked to structural diversity, so a mix of different sizes and ages of trees and plant species. So what do big trees do? So big trees are an organism that is more complex than a small tree. So they have complex canopies, right? So if you look up in an old growth forest, the canopies look crazy and weird, and they're not, by no means are they simple. And they provide really interesting nesting and foraging habitat for all these different species of birds and mammals. They have thicker bark, so a species that is linked to species that are linked to old growth forests that are not linked to our younger forests are stuff like brown creeper and nuthatches, who are these bark foragers, because the bark of these trees provide really amazing habitat for invertebrates and for lichen and bryophytes, mosses and liverworts, and places, you know, for foraging for all these little birds that creep up and down the bark and are hunting for little insects and little insect eggs and stuff like that. They often have cavities. So cavities, a hole in a tree, and cavities are these really incredibly important structures, again, produced by woodpeckers when woodpeckers are usually looking for bugs. to eat, and utilized by all different kinds of things. Cavity trees, trees that have holes in them, are some of the most rich with life of any habitat feature in the forest. We call them wildlife hotels. Everything from barred owls, pileated woodpeckers, chickadees, flying squirrels, which are actually our most populous species of squirrel. They all need cavities in trees. Big trees are also really important because they're future big dead wood, which, when I leave a big tree in the woods and that a logger really wants to cut, and if I told them that, they'd kill me. But I think big dead trees are almost as important from an ecological perspective and from a wildlife habitat perspective as big live trees. We'll talk about that more in a second. The other thing that they do, which is not directly linked to wildlife, is that we know from studies of old growth forests and our increasing knowledge about the underground connections between forests, so what we call the wood wide web, these fungal networks that are facilitating communication and resource exchange between trees. We know that these big established old trees have more connections. Dr. Susan Simard, who's a pioneer of studying the wood wide web, she calls them mother trees, and they actually will allocate resources around, share resources between different tree species and between different generations of trees. Also really important is this is something that most people can encourage in their forest actively, because most of our forests are not complex. So complexity, or what we call structural diversity, again, I've said this a million times already, and I'm going to probably say it a million more, just encouraging, instead of one size of tree, one age of trees, what we call an even-aged forest, all trees that are just like, it looks beautiful. They're all spaced evenly and they're all the same height. That is what we do not want, right? So we can actively encourage, using forest management in specific ways, encourage our forests to basically become more complex. So creating little gap openings, encouraging some trees to stay and become bigger trees, and also creating opportunities for new trees to regenerate. Structural diversity is comprised of two different things. So it's different sizes and ages of trees growing together. So a little tree growing right next to a middle-sized tree, growing right next to a big tree. And it's also what we call horizontal structural diversity, which is just pockets of different sizes of trees. So in your forest, if you had a pocket of very young trees and a pocket of middle-aged trees and a pocket of old trees, that could also be considered structural diversity. We'd call it horizontal structural diversity. And the reason that this is important is because I think about species diversity, so the different species of trees that we have. So that's sort of, what we have, right? That's all these different species of trees. But I think about structural diversity as the way that those trees are growing. So it's not just like you throw a bunch of species of trees in a box, and if you got them all, you got a good forest. It's way more complicated than that. Different species of animals will utilize different species of trees and plants and shrubs at different stages of development. Some bird species, for example, need to nest in young shrubby stuff, need to sing in tall trees, and hang out in the mid-story most of the time. Some of them are endemic to certain sizes and ages of trees, and some of them need a mix of different habitats at different times in their life and for different functions. And so it's really important to have a diversity of different ages of trees in addition to species of trees. Dead wood is incredibly important as well. So again, we think about dead wood. This is something that we need to clean up, right? It's also called coarse woody debris or coarse woody material. My favorite new term that I learned is necromass. So living wood is biomass and dead wood is necromass. Dead wood is like the unsung hero of the forest. So it provides habitat for all the stuff we don't care about, like unpopular stuff like bugs, fungi, amphibians. Invertebrates, again, base of the forest, food web, they're performing all these really incredibly important critical functions related especially to like the recycling of materials in the forest, but they're also getting eaten by bigger animals that we care about. Salamanders are this incredibly important species, which is also strongly linked to like old growth forests with a lot of dead wood, less linked to our younger forests. And they are at that tiny level, they are like the apex predator. So they're apex predator, really having the same influence, just like wolves would on deer or something like that, really influencing those invertebrate populations in the way that they function. An interesting thing to think about, this is one of my sort of like eye-popper facts that I've learned is that salamanders combine for the most biomass of any vertebrate predator in the eastern forest. So you put all the salamanders on a scale and you put all the coyotes on the scale, the salamanders weigh more. They're incredibly important. These deadwood is also, providing future nutrients that are going to be recycled into the bodies of different trees and plants. Again, having this holistic sense, that's also going to benefit wildlife, right? Because future trees and plant species are going to provide habitat and forage for different wildlife. It's also important to note that deadwood often has more living biomass in it than living wood, just because of these incredible the structures that they are, as much as 4 times more living biomass in dead trees than in living trees, supporting fungi and bacteria and invertebrates and salamanders and all these other really cool things. Another feature, canopy gap. So this is just like little holes in the canopy. If you look at an old growth forest, they will have anything but that sort of uniform, even age canopy. They'll have this like very irregular canopy that's punctuated by these frequent gaps that are, range in size from a single tree to up to like 1/4 of an acre. And this is a specific one that's specifically interesting for birders because insectivorous birds really like them. Within the gap, there'll be a higher temperature, which will attract more insects. And so insectivorous birds will like perch on one side of the gap, fly through it, catch insects, and then land on the other side of the gap. It also creates, anytime you're releasing light to the forest floor, you're creating regeneration. You're creating opportunity for more diversity at the forest floor level, which is providing everything from more diversity in herbaceous plant communities and the species that eat and use those different herbaceous plants, and to like raspberries and blackberries and stuff like black bears and many birds that are utilizing those raspberries and blackberries. Another thing that we want to encourage, I mentioned that this is a feature, young forest or early successional forest is something that, we think it used to be on our landscape, maybe about 5% of our landscape was in this condition, less than 20 years old. And now it's actually less common. And it's not something that's appropriate to create everywhere, but it is sometimes appropriate to create. And where it is created, it's an incredibly diverse habitat type. So most diverse that we have, probably in terms of the sheer number of plant and tree species that utilize them, and also wildlife species that utilize them. So there's an area at the Heinsberg Town Forest that was a red pine plantation, and in 2010 all blew over, and now it's like in this young forest condition. And if you go out there in the spring, you'll see all kinds of birders out there because they're looking for species that bird species that you can't find anywhere else. They're looking for Canada warblers and magnolia warblers and white-throated sparrows and all these other, cool bird species I don't even know about. So it's just a really, really interesting habitat type that follows actually what can be a really scary and catastrophic disturbance, like big opening, more than a couple of acres in size. And what you end up with 10 years later is this incredibly abundant, diverse young forest. And then finally, mast trees and shrubs. So what mast is just any seed of a tree that wildlife like to eat. There's soft mast, which is like berries and apples, stuff like that, cherries. And then there's hard mast, which is stuff like the beech nuts in this picture, acorns, hickory nuts. These are specifically, these are often foods that mature later in the summer and in the fall and are really important, especially to a bunch of wildlife species, because you have your neotropical songbirds who are going to be feeding on them, getting ready for migration. You have like your bears who need to fatten up, getting ready for hibernation. And then you have species like deer who are just going to stick it out all winter and need to fatten up in preparation for that. The really interesting things about mast trees and shrubs is that these are also trees and shrubs and plants that are endemic to all different kinds of forest types and all different kinds of stages in forest development. So like in young forest, you're going to get a lot of raspberries and blackberries, whereas in older, more mature forest, you're going to tend towards beech. So managing for a diversity of different habitat types is also going to manage for different types of mast trees and shrubs. If you there are things you can do like releasing mast trees. So actually taking your mast tree and cutting the trees that are competing with them, which will help them expand their crowns in the case of stuff like oak and beech, and they'll produce more mast. Black cherry, hickory, stuff like that. So in addition to managing for healthy forests, we also want to manage for landscapes that are healthy. So I mentioned that in addition to our forests not being as diverse, providing as many diverse habitats as just a few hundred years ago, our landscapes are also not as diverse. And so what we can do to fix this is to manage some of our young simple forests to be more resilient, diverse, complex. So doing stuff like using like the cutting of trees, creating small scale disturbances to stimulate the creation of that more diverse structure, creating pockets of habitat that are underrepresented across our landscape, stuff like young forest, but also stuff like unmanaged forests. So, we don't need to be, in the forestry camp, it can be sort of like divisive. Some people are like, I like unmanaged forests, old growth forests. And so any cutting of trees is like completely bad. And then some people are like, forests only exist to be managed. And so the idea of an unmanaged forest is very threatening to me. And it really can't be that way. It really needs to be a balance of all of those different things. And there's opportunities to do all of them. It doesn't need to be sort of this like existential threat to us if every forest across the whole landscape isn't managed in exactly the same way, which is the way that we want. And we want to make them more resilient. So again, thinking about as we're in a changing climate, I didn't talk really about what that word means, but resilience is the ability of a forest to stay healthy amidst great stress. And with all the stressors that we put on our forests and with the climate changing, we need to really be thinking about making our forests and our landscapes more resilient actively. And making them more diverse is one way to do that. There's also this idea of, there may be individual species that warrant certain specific protections, like wood turtles, like spruce grouse, that we are gonna just go all out because they're in trouble, and we're gonna protect them individually. And then there's others, like most of the other ones that I've been talking about, where we're gonna use what's called a coarse filter. So just generally providing healthy habitats in proportion across our landscape, and knowing that if we do that, we're going to have enough habitat for all of these different wildlife species. There will always be some wildlife species that need special attention. It's just the way it is. So I've got we've got more time too, but I've got 8 minutes till 7:30, so I'm going to zoom through these so we have a chance to answer your questions. So in addition to all that other stuff we talked about, just sort of that legacy that we've inherited, there are also a number of individual sort of more acute threats. One of these is what we call global change. So I used to talk about climate change, and then Tony D'Amato, who's an amazing professor and resource at the University of Vermont, I went to a presentation of his and he started talking about global change. So global change is just the idea that it's climate change plus. So it's climate change plus all these other human created stressors that we've put on our landscape. That is it more accurately captures really the stress that our landscape is under. So we have climate change plus invasive exotic plants, animals, pests, and pathogens that we've introduced to our landscape that have changed the way our ecosystems work. The fact that we're losing forest, it's being converted to other uses, it's being fragmented, cut into smaller and smaller pieces, and made so that wildlife don't necessarily have the connectivity that they need to get between one block of forest to another block of forest, or one ecosystem to another ecosystem that they need to do everything they need to do. Pollution, and more. And so in the context of that, it means that we have a situation which is needs to be addressed, which is not going to solve itself. And so we need to think about how we're managing our forests to be resilient and also to be adaptive so that our ecosystems can change. And as part of our ecosystems, our wildlife can get the things that they need to as our forests get stressed with all these different changes. We need to create landscapes which are connected and which are functional and which are resilient and which have habitats for the whole range of native species that we want to encourage. Invasive plants, I'm not going to go into invasives broadly. That's the brown tree snake, which has driven all of Guam's birds to extinction. It's really bleak. Invasive exotic plants are a huge threat in addition to diseases and pests like the emerald ash borer. The difference is we introduced invasive exotic plants on purpose. They're ornamentals, or they were living fences, or whatever. And they are an existential threat to the health of our ecosystems. They decrease ecosystem diversity, resilience, health, carbon sequestration and storage, wildlife habitats. Specifically, their berries are eaten by wildlife and they aren't as nutritious. Water quality and more. And they will not get better on their own. And so, this is one of these things where you have to think about, do we, in addition to having, a right to all of the amazing resources on our landscape, do we also have some responsibility towards them to solve this problem? And this is really tough for people because in a lot of cases, these species, exotic plant species, are so resilient that they're almost impossible to kill without the use of herbicide. So it's become sort of this restoration tool that we need to use, but that not everybody feels comfortable with. Really tricky stuff. Forest loss, this is the one that really keeps me up at night because it's permanent. Much worse than bad logging, really, because forests can grow back from bad logging and they can't grow back from being developed. Development and also converting forests to other uses, parcelizing forests, so cutting, even if they're not physically cut up, making them into smaller and smaller parcels, which usually leads to fragmentation, which is then being fragmented by roads and trails. Like you can see here, this ridiculous big long driveway that's cutting through this whole block of forest, so someone can have a house with a nice view on a ridge, clear cutting the ridge top. That's in Vermont. It's really, really scary, and this is something that we need to advocate for both at the state level, so with stuff like Act 250, and then also at the local level, so joining your local planning commissions, being a part of your development review boards, and the way that you develop your communities to basically protect our ecosystems and our forested blocks from being fragmented. Deer overpopulation is also a really scary thing, and if you go down south, it's like all they talk about because it's a huge deal and it's coming our way, caused by a bunch of different things, largely the loss of their predators and then the loss of their new predators, which is us, as there's less and less hunters. Basically, the problem with deer is that they browse young trees. And so when there's too many of them, they can really completely steer the course of forest succession in one direction or another. They can make it so that trees that they like to eat are basically absent from the landscape, and all you have is invasive plants and other species that they don't like to eat, like beech. And in really bad cases, you can have something called forest disintegration, which is where nothing regenerates. That's terrifying. And so killing deer, another thing that's hard for a lot of people and is something that we absolutely need to do. And so management, I have 3 minutes for management, gang. So managing our forests actively. This is something that I believe in. I believe it's appropriate in a lot of situations and not in every situation. But as part of the balance, I think that there's stuff that we can do that is good. So it's really important to recognize that we live in a highly altered world. Some people call this geologic epoch that we're in, the Anthropocene, meaning that it's an era in which humans are the main influencer on our landscape and our globe. We're losing biodiversity really, really fast. We're losing the number of animals on our planet really fast. So we have 50% of the number of animals on the planet that we did in 1970. Not 50% of the species, but 50% of the number of animals. All kinds of impacts of climate change, invasive exotic plants, pests, animals, pathogens, degraded, shrinking, fragmented ecosystems. And in Vermont alone, where we think we're sort of removed from a lot of this stuff, we have extirpated and driven to extinction several native species. And I think that within that, there is an opportunity for us humans to actually be a positive part of our landscape, to actually see if we can be ourselves a keystone species, a species that acts on our landscape to provide really important habitat for a ton of different species. That acts, sort of not in our traditional role as getting rid of ecosystem diversity and ecological integrity, but in service of those things. I practice a type of forestry called ecological forestry. So this is the idea that we're managing forests not how we want them to be, but we're managing forests like they manage themselves. So we're managing them as complex systems for diversity, resilience, complexity, and within the context of how we know that old growth forests work and how forests naturally grow and develop. Management is appropriate. I think, in the case of a lot of these things, thinking about our wildlife populations and our ecosystems that are under stress. And there are things that we can actively do to help them out. In the case of wildlife, to help them out by actively creating habitat rather than waiting, hoping that that habitat's going to create itself. In the case of forests, actively driving disturbances like this group that I cut on my land. So this is just a little opening where I cut the trees to actively try and make my forest more diverse, creating that gap in the canopy, just like would be created if a bunch of trees fell over. But to try and do that because I know that I want my forest to be more resilient, and it's just not. And I can make it that way now and create that habitat, create that resilience now, sooner than it can create itself. And we can do it, which is also a really, really important thing, which is challenging for people while we're harvesting local renewable resources. So I'm not like a cords and boards guy, but I'm someone who loves forests, who loves ecosystems, who thinks that wildlife have intrinsic value and that forests have intrinsic value, and really believes in harvesting local renewable resources. And the reason why this is pertinent to wildlife is because a lot of the impacts on wildlife globally, right, are impacts that are driven by our behavior. So it's not, the fact that we get to consume resources from all over the world and you can go into the grocery store and get whatever you want. And we get to wear all these like clothes that are made of plastic and, all these other things are a function of the fact that we get to disperse our resource use and our consumption across the globe. Lucky us. However, that has impacts over ecosystems. So it's what I say is it's really not you don't have a choice over whether you want to impact ecosystems. It's what do you want that impact to be? And so for me, I would rather have an impact which maybe makes me uncomfortable, the cutting of trees, which I love, and the managing of forests, which I love, to create these local renewable resources because it's right there. It's in front of me. I know that I'm doing it in a way that I'm proud of, and I know exactly where that's coming from. The alternative is this sort of, that not in my backyard mentality, right? Where you're saying, I don't like this here, but you're still continuing to consume resources. You're just saying, I'm just gonna put the brunt of the impacts from my resource consumption onto people who don't have the privilege to say that, right? And so there's something that's really powerful about local resources in general, because we get to actually have oversight over them. There's something that's really important about renewable resources, right? Instead of non-renewable resources, which is what the alternative usually is. And then also there's something that I think is really powerful and brave about people, even when managing forests makes them really uncomfortable, saying, yes, I'm gonna do it because I understand that this is, part of how we build a better world, part of how we protect our ecosystems and protect our wildlife globally, right? And there's all these other reasons for that, but I think I'm gonna end it there and stop sharing my screen. And I would love to answer some questions if you have any. You can raise your hand or you can type them in the chat. Totally up to you. Maggie's got a question.
What do you recommend for ash trees? Like, is it better to go in and just take them out before they're even sick at this point, or just assume that they're all infested, or,
No, I mean, so it depends on the context. So a lot of people got freaked out when in some of our communities, they started proactively removing ash trees. So along power lines and right-of-ways and roadsides and stuff like that. In that case, proactively removing ash trees is completely appropriate. And I say that because in our, it's going to be a huge job. So like in Williston, which is one of the communities where they've been doing this, they have thousands of ash trees they have to remove. So they have to spread out, if they're doing those removals themselves, they have to spread out the capacity of their crews and the cost of, that plus the cost of replacing those trees potentially. They have to spread out, potentially like the risk. Like you don't want, if you waited until all the ash trees starting to die, suddenly you're going to be in a yank to like get all those ash trees all down at once before they start falling on people. And also it has aesthetic impacts. So you don't, you're going to have all your trees, on whole streets that are just all gone at once, rather than removing them sort of proactively and spreading that out over time. So in that case, I think it's completely appropriate. You need to know that in the woods, there's no, cutting ash trees doesn't have any benefit to, like, you're not going to help your neighbor, or you're not going to lower the infestation. You're not going to slow it down. It doesn't work that way. People have tried all that stuff, in the last 20 years since it arrived in Michigan, and it doesn't work. So the situation where it's appropriate to cut ash trees is more in the context of like, people who have a larger woodlot, who want to try and capture some of the value in those trees. If people want to do that, which is, I think, is also completely appropriate, you just want to not cut all of them. You want to leave some ash trees that are seed trees, because we actually want to continue to have ash that throws seed. We want to not cut all the ash trees in case there's resistant ash that's on the landscape. We used to think that the emerald ash borer was just going to move through the landscape, kill all the ash, run out of food, and die, and it just doesn't work that way, we realized. So our best chance is genetic diversity in the ash population. So we actually want to like encourage the regeneration of ash, and so that can mean leaving ash seed trees, leaving ash trees that are healthy in general in case they could be resistant, but then also like sometimes you could proactively create gaps. So an ash tree needs like a 1/4 of an acre gap to grow. It's one of our mid-tolerant species, semi-tolerant of shade, but not very tolerant of shade. So that's what you could do proactively, or you could let them all fall down, and you wouldn't be doing anything wrong by doing that. Any other questions, Elliot?
Yeah, so on the subject of ash, what's the current state of things in Chittenden County? What should we be, should we be on the lookout in our own forests? I've been taking a look, but like what will we see first if we did have them?
Yeah, so yeah, I learned a lot by going out like with the forest health people who are like the emerald ash borer people. Because you get these, all this information about how to identify it, and they're telling you to look for these little exit holes and stuff. You're never going to see the exit hole until it gets really, really bad. You're never going to see the bug. I have had multiple people turn bugs into my office that are all spotted tiger beetles, which is not the emerald ash borer, but they are like that emerald color. One lady was like, I caught this in my bird bath, and just like dropped it off my office, and it was not an emerald ash borer. What you're going to see is intense woodpecker damage in many cases. So you'll find like huge woodpecker flecking all up and down the tree. And what the people who look for emerald ash borer actually look for is they look for areas of exposed wood in the top of the tree, because the infestation starts up there. And then they put binoculars on it and look for those really distinctive galleries etched in the wood, those like tunnels that have those switchbacks, S-shaped galleries. Really, really distinctive. There's another species of borer that's actually in the same, it's closely related to the emerald ash borer, but it's native. It's called the red-headed borer, and that will have galleries that are straight lines. And so if you see galleries, if you see those etchings, sort of these etched grooves on the wood of the tree, that doesn't mean that it's emerald ash borer. It has to have that really distinctive S shape. So Elliot, like on yours, I would be looking for, if I saw the woodpecker damage, I would look for that. I would try and, if I saw really bad woodpecker damage, I'd try and peel the tree and see if you could see those galleries. If I saw an ash tree that was dying though, and there was exposed wood up in the top of the tree, I'd put binoculars on it, and I'd see if I could see those galleries. But they found it in Richmond, confirmed infestation. So when they find a confirmed infestation, they assume that it's 5 miles farther in like a circle. And they call that whole area the confirmed infested area. So that might even be, I don't know if it's all the way to Huntington Village or not. It might be, if it's 5 miles from Richmond. But it's a big chunk of it. And then 5 miles beyond that, they call like I think it's called the high risk area. And so that's an area that we expect to be infested shortly. And so, you know, most of Chittenden County at this point, it's just a question of when it's going to come. But slowing it down does have a benefit because it gives everybody more time to react. It gives our towns more time to react, our utilities, and people who have woodlots who want to set up, you know, an opportunity to do some forest management, gives everybody more time.
We've definitely seen it here in Heinsberg.
There's definitely, you know, it could be, and it's in Bristol. So it's sort of on both sides of you there. The other thing that's confusing though, is that there's also something called ash decline, which means ash trees dying and we don't know why, which is also really bad in some areas. So that can be very confusing as well. But look for those galleries if you've got ash trees that are declining like that. And it's one of those things, so like, if you have this like holistic approach, like my approach, I'm like a big picture, you know, protect the whole ecosystem, protect the function of the ecosystem and everything, rather than being like, I'm trying to protect individually deer, bear, you know, on down the line. And so it's hard for me, you know, when I say like, what are the impacts of the loss of ash, which is going to be virtual loss of ash, at least for now, from our landscape. What's that going to be on our wildlife? You know, it's hard to know the exact relationship with ash that all of the different species on our wildlife on our landscape have, but you know they're there. You know that it's going to change the way that our ecosystems work. It's going to change the way that our forests function, and that's going to change the way that the habitat that they offer for wildlife, in addition to any like specific associations that different organisms have with ash individually.
So Ethan, a quick question for you.
Sure.
As you know, I'm about to entertain some logging.
Yeah.
A lot of the logging these days seems to be a whole tree removal. I'm wondering now, especially based on this discussion tonight, is it prudent for us to be saying, hey, no, while taking whole trees is nice, we also want to leave some to just help with that dead wood in the understory and salamanders in the lower parts of the ecosystem?
I think about that a lot, Eric, because so there are situations where whole tree harvesting is completely appropriate and where it's like the only thing to do. So like on my land in Bolton, my land was intensively high graded. So high grading is the process where loggers go through and they cut all the nice trees, the healthy trees, and they leave all the unhealthy trees. So what you end up with is you're managing your forest to be less healthy, which is not a good idea if you're interested in anything more than just like temporary monetary benefit to you. And so I was left, you know, when I bought this place, it was just really unhealthy. And so in some places, the only way to get it healthy again was to restart. Like I cut bigger cuts because there were just 100% unhealthy trees. And the wood quality was so low that I couldn't have had anyone else do it. You know, no one else would have done it. And so they were, you know, those crews are super efficient, and they could make it work. And so I had them do it on my land. You know, also if you're doing like, you want to create some early successional habitat, you want to create some bigger openings, I think it's definitely appropriate. And there are other situations where it can be just fine. But I tend to work now with like cable skidders, what we call hand crews. So a person with a chainsaw and a cable skidder, which is like a big tractor with a cable winch. And I tell my logger that I work with right now, I said, you know, I'll go and I mark the trees that I want him to cut. And I say, you can leave anything you want in the woods. So like he doesn't do softwood pulp. So that means we're cutting pine trees, and it means that he, you know, gets the logs out and then he cuts it off and then he just leaves the top of the tree there. And I also say you may not cut up that top at all. So traditionally loggers were supposed to, they were supposed to cut everything so it laid down flat. And it was supposed
Run
to
it over with a skidder.
Yeah, and it has nothing to do with forest health. And again, it has just everything to do with aesthetics, and it actually diminishes the value from an ecological perspective of a lot of that big wood for a whole bunch of different reasons. One of those is also for deer browse. So I like to leave tons of dead wood in the forest for a lot of different reasons, but you can also create these like crazy jumbles that can shield young trees growing within them from deer browse. which is a benefit. So yeah, so I leave a ton of dead. And then when I say you can leave whatever you want in the woods, I mean, he has to cut everything, but that I don't care if it's a small tree that's really marginal and he just cuts it and leaves it on the ground, or he cuts the top off a tree and he leaves the top really big. That's fine. He's not going to leave anything in the woods that's like, has a whole lot of value anyway. And so it probably has as much value staying in the woods as it does coming out. And we can make it work that way. With some bigger operations, they wouldn't do that because they need to harvest all that low grade wood. The other thing that's really important to do in the service of leaving trees, or sort of having dead wood in your forest, is leaving trees that are gonna die. So like I leave also a lot of big trees in the woods. So I definitely cut big trees, and definitely, there are trees that I call biological legacy trees that are just big trees and they get to live in the woods, and their whole job is just to be big trees and to live in the woods, and then eventually to become big dead trees. So you're recruiting future trees like that. And so an option, on your job, Eric, because it's softwood, because it's pine and hemlock, a lot of it, it might be hard to find a cable crew that's willing to do that work, because, not to get too in the weeds with the markets, but like to move softwood pulp is really difficult. And so a lot of cable loggers don't want to cut a whole lot of softwood. And so you need to get a whole tree crew, because then they access the chip market, so they can chip all that softwood pulp or whatever.
Right.
But you could do that, but you could still leave legacy trees, right? So you could, even if you're creating a little, restrict them. So don't have them go through every square foot of your property. And even in the areas that they cut, make sure that in addition to the trees that you're leaving, that you want to leave and you want to grow and everything else, that you're leaving some trees that you're leaving just to be dead trees, and to be big trees. And in that way, they can just sort of be recruited into that. Even if a tree looks like it's going to fall over tomorrow, even better. I think that's completely okay. And we can put our heads together and think more specifically about how to do that. So I guess I don't think it's necessarily wrong, but I think it's something that we need to think about when we do whole tree harvesting, is like how we're going to keep dead wood in the woods.
Great, thank you.
Sort of inside baseball on that one. Any other questions? Oh, I see the chat here. Just John clarifying everything. Thanks, John.
Similar to my question about the ash, I guess, what about, trees with beech rust?
Beech is tricky. Beech is a really amazing species. So the way that beech grew traditionally, again, up until very recently, was that it was a dominant forest tree that in the Champlain Valley accounted for somewhere between, depending on the forest, historically between 40 and 60% of all the trees in our forest were beech.
Wow.
And that's because it's a very tolerant of shade. So shade tolerant, it's like the tortoise and the hare. Shade tolerant species they hang out in the understory of the forest. Everybody else grows faster and dies faster, and then they just keep on working their way up and up and up. And then when they get there, they live a long time. Same thing with hemlock, same thing with sugar maple. So with beech, they would just, stay in the understory, and even if they died, they can sprout from the root system. And so they would just persistently just keep coming, and then they live 400 to 600 years up there. And if you can think about the benefit to wildlife of that much beech of that size, it would be incredible, because they're producing beech nuts, and it would have been just like amazing. We don't have beech like that anymore. One reason for that is because of our land use history. So we haven't had time to really recruit beech into the forest, just because our forests are so young, and it takes a while to do that, for a forest to start to trend towards those shade tolerant species. But another reason is what we call the blight, the beech blight, beech bark disease, which is a complex of a scale insect and a fungus, and basically prevents beech from growing that way anymore. So instead of getting old, a lot of times by the time they're even like 10 inches in diameter, they're all pockmarked, and they don't have the smooth skin that I learned beech bark as elephant skin bark. They don't have that anymore. And when beech trees are stressed out, they shoot up those root sprouts, and they're stressed out all the time. So they just like, those root sprouts just like keep on coming. And in combination, so the fact that they're stressed out from beech bark disease, they don't most of the time ever grow into a healthy full-size tree. And the fact that deer don't like to eat them, so that a lot of times you get this beech monoculture in the understory because deer have eaten everything else and they leave the beech alone. As deer become more prominent in our landscape, that becomes more of an influence. Beech has become sort of like a weed species, which is really interesting. But a lot of foresters, to get anything but beech, they have to like specifically manage against the beech. Like on my land, I have to if I want to get anything but beech at all, I have to manage against the beech. So I have to like skew everything against the beech, and I will always have beech, but I'll also have something else, hopefully. It's tricky, in New York, it's definitely more of a thing, and there's foresters like use an herbicide on beech so they can get anything else and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a really complex and nuanced issue. But then you still find what I call clean beech, smooth bark beech, which probably has some resistance to the disease. And certainly, if you find big beech trees and if you find smooth bark beech trees, you should always leave them. The other interesting thing about beech trees is that bears obviously have like a really important relationship to beech trees. They love to visit them and climb up them and make bear nests in them, or like break all the branches into the middle and eat the beech nuts off them and stuff. So if you find trees that have lots of bear claw marks, those are also ones you want to leave. They're not always the healthiest ones. So they're like, sometimes you'll find one that just looks awful, but it's got bear claw marks all over them. Those are, I've heard them described as being culturally important to bears. So bears will visit them generation to generation. And if you put cameras around them, they can actually track that. Even when the same bears won't just climb up them and eat the beech nuts, they'll just visit them. They'll just walk around them. And they're just important to them. So bear clawed beech are also, clean beech and bear clawed beech are also ones you want to save. Any other questions? Cool.
Well, nobody else is asking. I'll ask
Okay,
one
go for it,
more.
Maggie.
So what about gypsy moths? There are, lots of nests on trees, and
You notice that?
Yeah.
Yeah, we think we might be ready for an outbreak.
Big time.
So yeah, I know that I was noticing it anecdotally this year, and then when somebody from the Forest Health Department said they do these periodic gypsy moth samples over in Brigham Hill in Essex, and saw like more than they'd ever seen before. So that could be a thing. I've never been through a gypsy moth outbreak, and so I'm this winter just sort of learning up on what that means, and I don't know yet, and we don't have clear guidance about what that means. But gypsy moth is a species that has implications for our oak. We don't think that it's not like emerald ash borer status of like going to go kill all the oak trees all at once, but it could be an issue, but we don't know yet. That's the best I can say. I gotta like keep a tight rein on my own feelings about that, because my property is like all oak, and so it feels very personal. So nobody panic.
So one more question then, Ethan, since nobody else is asking. This may not be in your area of expertise per se, but as you know, once upon a time, the forests in Vermont were heavily geared towards American chestnut. The American Chestnut Association, along with a lot of other people, have been doing a lot of work to crossbreed with Chinese and then rebreed back to American chestnut to become 98% or something American chestnut, but have the resistance. We as landowners, I think at some point in time, I hope anyway, will get the opportunity to start planting some of these to help regenerate our forests and get back where we were. I mean, in terms of a wildlife tree, they are wildly important, right? There's a lot of mass comes off for bear, turkey, deer, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that happening anytime soon? Are you in concert with that? Is that being taken up, on a state level or a New England level? And when do you expect, if anything, those trees will start to become available for public consumption to plant?
Yeah, I don't know. So I think that we're sort of the places where it was really prominent was actually like a little bit south of us, where they talk about chestnuts like knee high and stuff, like all that crazy stuff. But it definitely was here, and I see it sometimes. Down at my mom's place in Windham County, there's like some chestnut. Now it grows as like a shrub, and then the blight kills it. But yeah, people are doing it actually at a project at the Catamount Community Forest in Williston. We're doing this forest management project, which is part of this nationwide program called Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change. So it's basically doing forest management that's specifically geared and studied with an eye on how our forests adapt in a changing climate. And one of the things that we're going to do with that is underplanting American chestnuts. And so I think it's, you know, it's a cool opportunity. If I don't know how available those are, or if they're available at all. If they are, you probably want to get them from the American Chestnut Foundation, but I think that they're still just kind of figuring that out. I know that they bred a lot of them down south, and then there were cold tolerance issues with some of them. But you know, there's a lot of things you can do, like, so there's this just weird, very briefly, there's just sort of this weird divide of like people who they're like, I love the forest, and so I want to like completely step away from it. I don't want to do anything. I don't want to mess with it. I don't want to, you know, because I love the forest so much. And then there's people who are like the total opposite, who are like, who cares? It's a friggin' forest, you know, go do whatever you want. And I don't think that either of those strategies are really right. I think that what I gravitate towards is just being like, I think that there are things that we can do that are positive, you know, and like tinkering, you know, with the right things in mind, thinking about like healthy ecosystems, healthy wildlife populations holistically, rather than just like, what can I get out of this forest? We can do management in that context that's appropriate. And so that could involve stuff like, you know, underplanting blight-resistant American chestnut, and stuff like I do, which is like planting acorns, which are a species that, you know, could be, you know, more adaptive in a changing climate. Stuff like that, you know, thinning around trees proactively because we know that they're going to be increasingly stressed by climate change, making our forests more diverse because they're going to be increasingly stressed by climate change, creating habitats that are underrepresented across our landscape because of stuff that we've done. I just really think that just because human beings do have a really bad track record of managing our ecosystems doesn't mean that we can't do it. And I think that if anything, we actually have a responsibility to do it. And so I think that there's cool stuff like underplanting American chestnuts is like a great idea. Don't underplant common buckthorn, you know. Or like, you know, do the thing where we're like, we think that this species of tree is better than all of our species. Like, we're going to plant this hybrid poplar, which is going to take everything over, and it's going to grow way faster than our trees. It's way better. You know, think about like respect the ecosystems that exist and think about how to support them, and manipulate them in ways that is sort of just with that in mind. Cool. Okay. I think on that note, I'll let you guys all go. Thanks for hanging. And please, if you want to follow up with me about any of this stuff, I'm happy to do so. Oh, I got one more question. I'm going to answer it. Rich Winiger, sorry if I butchered your last name, Rich, said, what's your opinion on the best way to manage the deer population? We got to kill some deer, guys. It's another one of those things where it's not going to get better on its own. It's only going to get worse. And if you want to know what it's like when it gets really bad, you can just go south and look at what it's like in Massachusetts or Connecticut and all the issues that they have down there. Let's like deal with this before it becomes an issue. And we are the apex predator of this species now, which is our fault. But really what we need to do is kill antlerless deer, doe, to lower the population. I started bow hunting this year. They changed the rules in Vermont for hunting to specifically allow more killing of antlerless deer to lower the population, because they're seeing it start to get above where it's supposed to be, and killed a couple of doe. You know, and it's one of these things like cutting trees, like using herbicide on invasive plants. It's one of these things that it's not easy. It doesn't feel good all the time. you know, and like definitely felt really intense, but feels like, you know, I don't think that it should feel easy necessarily to do the right thing. But it is the right thing to do, to protect our ecosystems. It's not always going to be the thing where you're like, yeah, who cares? It's a tree. Nobody, you know, it can be more complex than that, and it can still be the right thing to do. But so you guys should all go try crossbows. And get the best meat ever too. Also, local renewable meat. Come on, guys. Best meat in the world. I'll give you a sample. What's that?
We'll leave that up to you to come hunt.
Okay, I'll try my hardest. I definitely tried a little too hard this year. So yeah, Eric knows. Great. So thanks everybody. Nice to see you all. And let me know if you have other questions that come up.
Thank you.
Ethan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks.